July 19, 1900, a man sits down for his morning coffee and reads his favorite newspaper, the San Francisco Call. He quickly turns to the story of a missing cat boat and two of its unfortunate occupants. But there's one headline that day that really piques his curiosity. It reads, "Terrible tortures practiced by the Chinese." He pushes his specs up his nose as he reads that nowhere on earth is any country so cruel and so devoted to fearful tortures, and that no place is so adept at devising new forms of martyrdom for the people they hate than in China. He reads on and discovers a slow kind of horror he's never heard about: the Kang. The newspaper article in the San Francisco Call was real, if not more than a little racially biased. Here's another line from that same article. A Chinaman would take no artistic pleasure in anything that killed quickly, or that reached its culmination of pain quickly. His victim must suffer a little more each hour. In that way, he makes his delight last long, and can keep a whole string of wretches to charm him by their slow dying for months. Yes, that part was unashamedly racist, and perhaps the writer was not too well read on the history of his own ancestors' cruelty. But the Kang was certainly a real thing, and indeed it could have been a long drawn-out punishment. It might have sometimes ended in death, but as you'll see today, it took on lots of forms. Let's talk about perhaps the most basic form first, something you could find in China around the time the article was written. If you've ever seen the stocks that they used in Europe and the US back in the day, it looked very similar. The main difference is that even though the offender's head was surrounded by two pieces of wooden board fastened together, he or she could actually move a bit more. There were variations on this too, such as sometimes the boards prevented him from getting his hands to his mouth, which meant he could neither eat nor drink by himself. In this case, he had to rely on family or passers-by for their charity. Maybe he could use his hands, but since the boards might weigh as much as 15 kilograms, getting around and living a normal life was not easy in the slightest. The yoke was no joke. As the descriptive writer in that newspaper article wrote, he might be kept in his Kang till madness or death ends his sufferings. You can only imagine how painful it must have been to be strapped inside one of those things. Sure, the victim might have stayed low to the ground, but for how many weeks can a person do that? The other thing is, this was supposed to be a form of public humiliation, just as the stocks were. And like the victims of the stocks, the public might have been the opposite of charitable. Maybe the man in the Kang had stolen from people in the village, or worse, maybe he'd committed a violent crime. What do you think would have happened to him in that case? Yeah, he might have been pelted with rocks and his life might have ended soon after. It goes a long way back too, but we can't say how far back exactly. There's some text from the Great Ming Legal Code of 1397, which states that the victim should be held in the Kang in relation to the nature of the crime he's committed. The weight of the Kang was also correlated with the gravity of the crime, a crime that would have been stated on paper and nailed to the device. At first, the sufferer might be able to take the weight, but over time, it became hellish. Again, in the words of that news story, in a week the torturers have the felicity of seeing a maddened wretch stumble and fall around blindly, weeping and yelling with anguish. That's if he could eat by himself, or the local people felt sorry enough for him and fed him. If not, his life expectancy in the Kang was only a few days, since the lack of water would have killed him. As for lack of food, starvation might have taken a few weeks. On the bright side, a well-liked person in the Kang could have been taken care of, and in the end, he might have just lost a bit of face. The newspaper story failed to mention that part. There was also beating by guards that might have happened in the Kang, which under the Yuan dynasty by law might have just been with a light stick 7 to 57 times. But it might have also been with a heavy stick 67 to 107 times, which could have resulted in death if a bribe hadn't been paid to lessen the force of the blows. The death would have been slow and usually a result of infected cuts. Remember, this was for lesser crimes too. For example, under the Yuan Code of 1277, 133 offenses could lead to execution, but under the Qing Code of 1740, a whopping 813 offenses merited the death penalty, usually by strangulation or decapitation, and to a lesser extent, slow slicing. With that in mind, Kang really was the least of an offender's worries. Believe it or not though, what we've talked about so far is the less brutal form of the Kang. We guess it's just a matter of perspective though. Would you prefer the chance to live on or just have your death over and done with quickly? Let us explain. Sometimes the person could move with the Kang, but other times the person would have the board fastened around their head and they would also be kept in a kind of wooden cage. Again, this might have happened in a public place as a means to show others what happens if someone created disorder. They might also have been left there until they died. The fear factor was described like this in legal text. If you govern by punishment, the people will fear. Being fearful, they will not commit villainies. There being no villainies, people will be happy. Its reasoning is as old as time, but time has shown us that sometimes the real villains might be the ones doing the punishing. That's why in China, like elsewhere, more barbaric rulers who had a penchant for the cruel and unusual were often replaced with reformists. In this respect, the killer form of the Kang might be seen as less brutal than other Chinese punishments in history, such as being cut to pieces, or boiled alive, or being slow-sliced to death. Then there was beheading, which was seen by people in China back in the day as less preferable to hanging. The reason is, a person wanted to keep their head on for the afterlife. This is why the Kang in the cage as a slow form of hanging, never mind if it took a long time, might have been a better way to die than a quick chop with the sword. Kang hanging went like this. The offender was placed in the Kang, then placed inside the cage. The Kang was then attached to the top of the cage. His feet couldn't touch the ground, but he wasn't left just hanging there because supports were placed under his feet. This was supposed to be a slow death, so only little by little were the supports removed, and the pressure on his neck would be incremental until he died. This sounds like something that happened a very long time ago, but it was exactly how some rebels in the 1900 Boxer Rebellion were treated after they were arrested. There's a photo to prove it, with a note saying that it was done to appease foreign powers. The Boxers were not keen on foreigners and certainly Christian missionaries, but it's a complex story we won't get into today. We'll just say that when it came to the Kang, this form meant certain death, and it wasn't an express kind of execution. We've also seen other photos, one of them likely taken by a French person because it explains in French that a woman is sentenced to death by strangulation in the Kang.